For this one, we're also writing another method for string formatter, and it's called format. So again, string formatter is the entire class. So anything that we're working on in here, we can call within the one that we're going to write. So format, that's what we're asked to write, and it returns a formatted string. Actually, let's read it. Which returns a formatted string as defined earlier. So it has the basic gaps, and any leftovers get inserted from left to right. And then we're also supposed to use some method called leftover spaces, which has already been implemented, but we don't know exactly how it works. But we are given a description of it right here, and it's very simple. It returns the number of leftover spaces when word list is used to produce a formatted string from formatted. So that's saying which has already been implemented. This method returns the number of leftover spaces as defined earlier. So maybe we should remember as it was defined earlier. So if we take a look at this, I'm going to read it from the top again. This question involves a process taking a list of words list and producing a formatted string of a specified length. The word list contains at least 2 words consisting of letters only. When the formatted string is constructed, spaces are placed in the gaps between words so that as many spaces as possible are evenly distributed into each gap. The equal number of spaces inserted into each gap is referred to as the basic gap width. Here it is. Any leftover spaces are inserted one at a time into the gaps from left to right until there are no more leftover spaces. So anytime, this is something that I noticed, anytime there are leftover spaces, it's just one more space than what the basic gap is. Otherwise, if it was 2 more spaces, you would have been able to put more in the other basic gaps. So the leftover spaces, there are only going to be 1 more space than the basic gap. So if we have any leftovers, we're just going to add 1 space to the basic gap. So there we go for that. So leftover spaces returns the number of leftover spaces. Okay, that's great because it returns an integer. And then we have our method list. These are the ones that we're allowed to use, except for we're writing this one, so these are what we're allowed to use. We have to use, what does it say? We have to use leftover spaces correctly. I think. I'm fairly certain. Assume that the basic, blah, blah, blah. Yes, you must use basic gap width, which is the one that we wrote before. It returns the number of spaces in a basic gap, and then the number of leftover spaces. We have to use that method as well. So what we are trying to do is return a string of those words formatted properly, formatted how we were told to format them. That means each word has the basic gap in between them, and if there are any leftover spaces, you insert those from left to right. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is create a string that has, that is for my formatted string. I'm just going to call it formatted. I'm going to create a string. This is where I'm going to put my formatted stuff. And then I'm going to call it formatted. So this is what I'm actually going to return, because I have to return a string formatted. And I'm going to put in nothing. So that's like a blank space there. So there. So it has nothing in it, but it is a string, and now I can put other stuff. Formatted. Okay, that's the first thing that I'm thinking of. Then what I want to do is think about, well, how many spaces is a basic gap? Actually, I'm going to create a string. Now, in the solutions online, it's done differently, but this is the way that I came up with doing it, and I like this way. But either way is fine. So first I need also, and I'm going to leave some space. I'm going to write down all the stuff that I am writing down. I'm writing it down in the order that I kind of figured it out. So when I go back and add stuff, that's because, well, I realized, oh, I need this. So I'm going to add it in the top somewhere. So right now, my decision was to get a string that was called basic gap, and put in the correct number of spaces into that string. So the string basic gap, so I'm making this up, basic gap, that's going to get, well, first of all, right now it's going to get nothing. That looks like it has a space in it, so I'm going to make it not have a space. So the basic gap has nothing in it, but I'm going to use a for loop and just run through and put in however many, because I don't actually know how many spaces are in a basic gap yet. However, I do have a method that I can use to figure that out. So how does that method work? Well, it outputs the number of spaces, and then it takes as arguments a string and the formatted length. Okay, so basic gaps, I'm going to say for int I gets 0, and then while I is less than, and here's where I'm going to use my basic gap width method. And remember, we're writing a method inside this class, so I'm allowed to use any of these previously written methods. So, and I have to use them because it says to. So basic gap width, and how do I use that? Well, I have to put in my word list, which I'm passed from as an argument to format. So this parameter word list I could put in word list, and then it also takes in the formatted length, so I need to pass that as well. So there we go. So that's the middle part, and then I++. So what is this for loop doing? So the basic gap width method returns the number of spaces in a basic gap. It returns that number. So this loop just runs however many times there are spaces in the basic gap width. So what I need to do is use this loop to actually put those blank spaces in my basic gap string. So that's what I'm going to do. So with that line of code, I'm actually putting in one extra space. So this is going to be run a couple of times, possibly a couple of times, where the first time basic gap has nothing. So when I say basic gap plus a space gets stored into basic gap, the first time that this runs, when I is 0, I'm just putting in this single space because this doesn't have anything in it. The next time I'm adding, this previous space now is stored in basic gap, and I'm adding another space to it. So basic gap, after this loop is completed, will have the correct number of blank spaces in it. So now I want to start actually building my formatted string, this string, so I can return it after I'm done. But remember, there are basic gaps, and then there are leftover spaces. So I have to use this somehow. So I'm going to need to, I could just use the method whenever I need the leftover spaces, but I'm going to create a variable called leftovers. And I'm going to be using the leftover spaces method. And how I can go back up to this little box, and it shows me how to use it. I can just call it and then input the word list, which was passed to format, so that's good. And also the formatted length, which is also passed to format, so I can use those. So int, I'm just going to call it leftovers, and that's going to get the name leftover spaces, and I'm going to pass it word list. So now I have the number of leftover spaces, the number of extra spaces that are going to be added to the leftmost basic gaps until I run out. So now I can actually start building my formatted string, but I'm going to have to use a loop to do this. I'm thinking okay, what I want to do is take the first word from my word list, take the first word, I want to point, so take the first word from here and put it in my formatted string. Then I want to add a basic gap And if I have any leftover spaces, I want to add a leftover space also. And then the next time around, I'll add the second word to my word list, and I want to add my basic gap. And if I still have any leftover spaces, I want to add that extra leftover space. So hopefully, just with the way that I'm saying this, you can start to understand how I'm going to actually build this formatted string. So first, it's definitely in a loop, so I'm going to create a loop. And you might think that the loop is just however long this word list is, but at the very end of the word list, there are no spaces. If I go back to this, the last word doesn't have any spaces afterwards. So actually, I want to write my loop for all but one word. So that's what I'm going to do right now, because the loop is to fill the formatted string. The loop is to fill this with the words and then spaces after. So I don't want to use it for my last word because it doesn't have any spaces after. So I'll say, I'll write a for loop. Now I want to go through this loop as many times as I have words except for the last word. So how do I say that? I can say for int I gets 0, I should be less than word list dot size, because that's a list. But I don't want, I'm going to do this in red. I don't want to go to my, this would get me to my actual last word. But I don't want to do that. I want to do one before, so I have to have the -1 there. So now in my for loop, I'm going from my first word all the way to the second to the last word, as long as I increment properly, not a T and I. So that's my for loop that runs through my word list, and I can now access every single word except for the second to the last word, and that's what the parentheses, the red parentheses, are telling me. So what do I want to do? Well, I want to start building my formatted string. So I can say formatted, which has nothing in it, and I'm going to say take this and put in formatted plus my basic gap. However, I want to know if I have any leftover spaces. So actually this is going to have to go, I'm going to erase this. This has to go inside an if, because there's two cases. I either want to put in the word and the basic gap and a leftover space, or I want to put in the word and just the basic gap. So I have to make an if statement for that. And the if statement that I'm going to use is if leftovers, meaning how many, like this is the number of leftover spaces, that's what this method gave to me. So I say if leftovers is greater than 0, that means I have leftover spaces. So if there are leftover spaces, then what I'm going to do, now I can start building my formatted string. And I want to, so if I have leftover spaces, I want to take my formatted string, I want to add to it the basic gap, and then also my leftover spaces. But again, if I have leftover spaces, there's only going to be one leftover space to be added to each basic gap. Otherwise, if we had more than one, we could have increased the basic gap size. So formatted plus and then my leftover space. Because if this is true, then this is, I want to be adding a leftover space. So that's what this is. That's the leftover space. But then after this, after I add this, I want to decrement my leftovers, because now I have one less leftover space. So when I go to the next iteration of the loop, I have one leftover space, and eventually I'll get no leftover spaces, and then I'll just be adding, well, I'll write the rest of the else for that part. But I want to decrement my leftovers, because this if statement is inside a loop. So this if statement will run exactly however many times there are leftover spaces. So if there are 3 leftover spaces, then I'm going to be adding 1 space to the basic gap, but I'm going to be doing that 3 times. So for 3 of the basic gaps. And the rest of the basic gaps, if there are any, will just get basic gaps. So that takes care of the first part of the string, where I am adding basic gaps and a leftover space. Else, so if I have no more leftover spaces, then I can just add, oh, I ran out of room. my basic gap because I don't have any more leftover spaces. So when I run out, I'm still continuing with my loop, but I'm now only adding just basic gaps. I'm not adding an extra space to that. So I'm done with putting in all of the words and the gaps after them. The next thing I need is the last word, because remember, this only went up to the second to the last word. So I need to now add in the last word, all like just by itself. But that's going to be outside of the loop because I'm only doing it one time. So then I say formatted plus, formatted gets formatted plus, and then the very last word. How do I get the very last word? Well, I can say word list dot get, and here I want to get the last word in word list. Now that I need the last index. Remember, word list dot length, or actually no, that's for an array. Word list dot size, that gets me the entire size of the list. However, that's one index too far, because remember we start at 0, so if the size is 5, then that would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, because that's 5 different things. So word list dot size gives you, so if I said 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, if I said, so something was this long, that would be size 5, but my last index is 4. So really, to get the last word in word list, I would say get word list dot size, and I'm running in a room. So word list dot size, but that gets me to over here, so I want to subtract 1. And that gets me my last word. So that's where that comes in, and yeah, it puts the last word into formatted along with the rest of the formatted stuff. And then now I still need my return statement. So at the very end, we are trying to public static string. We're returning a string, so I need to return formatted. And once I do that, my method is finished, and I can close the last or the last bracket. So there we go, like Batman. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm trying to spend a lot of time and explain it well, but I don't know.